speed and scale.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. It is the 10th day of August, 2026. And you're listening to Global Affairs Unfiltered with me, Jack Stockwell. I'll be here for an hour this morning trying to bring everything up to date with a general idea of what's going on out there. To all the nuclear states that are out there talking about something that is absolutely impossible to talk about without some degree of fear and worry and concern. There was a solemn ceremony that took place yesterday where the mayor of Nagasaki, Shiro Suzuki, strongly condemned the sophistical arguments that nuclear weapons increase security. And this, of course, was the anniversary of the bombing of Nagasaki. It was 81 years ago or something like that. And he called for all the nuclear states to immediately face the dangerous, increasingly dangerous reality that the mere possession of these weapons dramatically increases the risks for global war. And so he was speaking at a solemn ceremony commemorating the 70,000 civilians who died from a nuclear bomb dropped on Nagasaki yesterday in 1945, August 9th. And he firmly rejected the both the line that nuclear arsenals help to deter potential attackers and the tendency for nations' leaders to rely on these weapons. Rather, he said what it actually has created is an increasingly fragile security. And so, according to AP News, where I get this, he urged that this dangerous reality be addressed immediately. The Associated Press quoted him as saying this: "The theory of nuclear deterrence is extremely dangerous and fragile. Nuclear weapons are not a necessary evil, but an absolute evil, and can never coexist with humanity. To all leaders of the nuclear states and nations relying on nuclear deterrence, you must face the reality that the more you rely on nuclear deterrence, the more you increase the risk of a nuclear war." Now, in attendance, of course, was the Japanese Prime Minister, Sanae Takichi. And Suzuki had called on the Japanese leaders who are undermining Japan's constitutional ban on aggressive war, because as I have reported in the past, and I'm sure you are aware, Japan is building its army up way past what it agreed to do in the 1945 surrender. But the over 90 countries were present at the ceremony yesterday in Nagasaki, with an emotionally stunning period of silence from the crowd at the exact moment, time-wise, on the clock, when the plutonium bomb detonated. So kind of imagine yourself being there at this ceremony yesterday. And the ceremony was timed in such a way so that when Suzuki, the mayor, was talking about this, he counted down to the time on the clock 81 years ago when the bomb went off. And of course, they were meeting at the site of the explosion. Just imagine yourself being there at that ceremony yesterday. Now, with that being said, Elbridge Colby, who's the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, currently Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Think about what that title means. It's his job to formulate defense policy and report to the Secretary of Defense, or Secretary of War, as Hegseth prefers it called, who will refer that to the president. So he's just, one voice away from the person who has direct influence on the president. And so he was in Omaha, Nebraska last Wednesday, and he said that the United States has to pursue arms control while at the same time maintaining a credible nuclear deterrent, in contrast to what Mayor Suzuki was saying. And he asserted that the future agreements that we have with other countries has to account for China's rise and the consequent evolving necessary for nuclear deterrent proliferation. I think that's what he called it, whatever that means. At the same time, contemplating the military rise of China. So it wasn't bad enough we had a Cold War with Russia. Well, now we have a war with Russia, not cold anymore. Essentially, we say that it's NATO's war against Russia, but it's really the United States war against Russia, with Ukraine being the battleground. And the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy is saying we need to continue proliferation measures out of one side of his mouth, blaming it on China out of the other side. And he said this, quote, "I think the most important thing that we can do on the Department of War side to make sure that there are not such pressures from nuclear proliferation is to make sure that we have a credible, rational nuclear option." Now, this is two voices away from the president. Instead of talking about nuclear limitation, talking about nuclear proliferation, he said that arms control should not be viewed solely through the lens of formal treaties, because he says that future arrangements could involve broader mechanisms that establish, you have to read between the lines here, that would establish implicit barriers and thresholds between competitors. He says it's not necessarily all or nothing. He says if you're having productive discussions, it can be productive. But he said the purpose of arms control is not eliminating nuclear weapons, which he says is unrealistic, but reducing the incentives for conflict. He says the goal of arms control is to mitigate pressures towards conflict. And then he said that arms control engagement with China is possible if approached through original concepts rather than focusing exclusively, he said, on legally binding agreements. Now just think about that. He says arms control engagement with China is possible if it's approached through its original concept rather than focusing on legally binding agreements. It doesn't matter what we legally agree to do with China. We have to follow our original policies. What original policies? Brzezinski's chessboard? He says, I think the act of engaging, he says, can be productive. Well, in very nuanced bureaucratic code, I think what he is saying here is absolutely insane. It can be explained, knowing the mindset of the neocons and those who want the complete demise of Russia and China so that American hegemony can regain its control of this planet and be unopposed from thereafter. We are fighting Washington. We, the United States, is fighting one war in Iran while massively funding another war in Ukraine. And this hardcore Colby China basher, because he's been a China basher for some time now, can hardly object if we end up in a third conflict with China over Taiwan. And it's the world's worst kept secret right now. And you all know it because you've been hearing it if you've been following the alt news. That America is rapidly depleting its conventional arms stockpile. Now think about that for a minute. Our medium range missiles, the Tomahawk, the JASSM, these different things, the Cruise, are rapidly being depleted because of their use against Iran and what we have given to Ukraine, that Ukraine is sold on the black market to African nations. And it is the conventional type arms, not nuclear, conventional. And what does that mean? When you give up, despite the fact that there are billions of dollars being asked for now from Congress to the Department of Defense, to go to Raytheon and the rest of the boys to rearm these short-range, medium-range missiles, which take years to do. You don't just go and turn on the production line for Tomahawk missiles. They require strategic minerals that we don't have, like gallium, that you have to get from China, because China is the only source of gallium right now. And because of the sensitive guidance material that exists inside the nose cones of these missiles, that guide these missiles using GPS data and extremely sophisticated electronic targeting algorithms. And when China is not giving them to us right now, it just gets more and more insane all the time. So what's left if you have gotten rid of these missiles that we've been using up to this point? What do you have left but your big, bad strategic atomic bombs? Now, of course, if we had these little baby petite tactical nukes, the adversary would know whether we are, at this point, sufficiently deranged to use them or not. But was this calculated from the beginning? Was this calculated to, you've got PACOM upset over the fact that the missiles that they were using to defend Taiwan are rapidly being transferred over to the Middle East? So that if China was to do something, and China is not going to do something, they're taking over Taiwan politically. The ruling party in Taiwan right now wants to become part of China. Not by a majority vote, by a slim vote. And so China doesn't have to waste any time at war. Because a good portion of the Taiwanese see themselves as Chinese. And China has said, you can be like Hong Kong. You can continue your business. You can continue your ownerships. You can continue everything. We just want you to come back into the family. Now, top nuclear weapons expert, MIT professor Ted Postel, that I've quoted numerous times, has long insisted that just a single strike of a mini nuke, a tactical nuke, launched in any of the theaters where they currently exist, is overwhelmingly likely to ignite a chain reaction that he said within 4 to 5 days would eliminate all of civilization, fighting a nuclear war he said, is like being a little bit pregnant. There's no such thing. Now, the financial elites who are headquartered in London and Wall Street right now are desperate. This gigantic bubble of speculation that they've expanded over decades can't be sustained a whole lot longer by ever increasing investments in artificial intelligence and data centers. And their wars, the London wars, the Wall Street wars, they're hand in hand in this. In Iran and Ukraine are each sputtering out of control, although for different reasons. But their biggest nightmare is that nearly 3/4 of the world, actually it's about 80%, is moving slowly but surely to a whole new security and economic architecture based on sovereign nations and scientifically vectored physical economy. Now, to these oligarchs in London and Wall Street, they have got to do something, and they have got to do something fast because they're quickly losing control. So, I don't know what the press had to say to Colby in Omaha, or if the press was present, but I don't know I haven't got any information on press conferences or anything like that. But I hope somebody raised their hand and said, Mr. Colby, why are we fighting these wars at all? We are in the Ukraine defending the political heirs of 1940s Hitler's ally and anti-Semitic mass murderer Stepan Bandera. And in Israel, Netanyahu is the political and biological descendant of the networks led by Vladimir Jabotinsky, the Jewish fascist who was best friends with Mussolini for decades. Why are we doing this? Now, on Saturday, 2 days ago, the Washington Post obtained a memo written by Deputy Defense Secretary Steve Feinberg that urges, in conjunction with what I've been saying, munitions and weapons companies to rapidly increase their output. And specifically, he wrote that various companies, the military-industrial complex, had 21 days to submit plans on how they're going to drive significantly faster, more aggressive delivery schedules, and/or increase production for critical capabilities. That's an exact quote. And the memo was confirmed to be real by a Pentagon spokesperson, Sean Parnell, in response to a CNN report that said this: the August 5th memo is real. It will inform the fiscal year 2028 budget submitted to Congress for funding, and it is entirely consistent with our ongoing push to rebuild the defense industrial base. Here is the Pentagon saying we need to rebuild our defense because of what I just got through saying for the most part of the opening minutes of this program. That all these things have been depleted, fighting a war we've already lost. Iran has won the Iran war. And in the case of the Ukraine, Russia is just cleaning up. I mean, taking over the ports at Odessa and cutting off the Ukraine from a warm water seaport. It's over with. Now, there are rumors within the White House that President Trump, and there have been reports of this, very upset, foot-stomping, mad upset, as to why the United States currently has such a short stockpile of munitions. No, someone's been telling him along the way, President Trump, we're running out of bombs, we're running out of bombs. The Washington Post has previously reported that the U.S. has fired off more than 850 Tomahawk cruise missiles against Iran, as well as more than 1,000 Patriot missiles and THAAD interceptors. Now, I remember when the thing broke out back in February 28th, the second Iran war. The first one was June of last year, June 12th. That experts were saying that for every incoming missile from Iran towards Israel, they would always fire 2 missiles, because if one missed it, the second one should get it. What I have since learned, studying this even further, they may fire up to 10 missiles, Patriots or a THAAD, against an incoming missile to try to knock it down. How long can you do that with no missiles left? And that's the position we're in now. The Washington Post cites a report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies that says the current global inventory of Patriot missiles has fallen from 2,200 before the war began to fewer than 827. Now, the Pentagon and this may be one of the reasons why Trump one day is ready to obliterate Iran, and the next day he calls it off. And then the next day he's ready to obliterate Iran, and the next day he calls it off. I've lost count how many times this has gone on. But the Pentagon is seeking to rapidly expand U.S. weapons production by strengthening the partnerships with traditional defense contractors and the Silicon Valley startups. So in May of this year, the Defense Department signed agreements with several defense tech firms to boost strike capacity and acquire lower cost missiles. I mean, like the Iranians who have won this war with defensive missiles and drones that cost 10% of what an American missile costs. And don't misunderstand me here. I'm an American citizen. I will stand by my country, but I'm not going to keep my mouth shut when my country's doing things that I don't think my country should be doing. So Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has called for a very broad overhaul of the Pentagon's acquisition system, saying that the bureaucratic barriers have slowed innovation and production. What is he saying when he says bureaucratic barriers? Well, the military-industrial construct, complex, and everything associated with it is so integrated into the Pentagon. It's like metastatic cancer of the brain that is so invasive, surgery is impossible without destroying the brain. So you go home and get your affairs in order. We'll give you morphine to help you with the pain, but you will be dead before Christmas. The military-industrial complex tentacles are so deeply ingrained in both houses of Congress and in the Pentagon and the Defense Department, wherever it is, including Omaha, that it's hard to tell where one ends and the other one begins. And so when the Defense Department comes out and says, well, there's certain bureaucratic barriers that slowed things down. Yeah, because when the Defense Department says we want this and that, and we want it done this way and that way, and the military-industrial complex says, wait a minute. You can't do it that way and this way, but you can do it this way. So Hegseth said his goal is to work more closely with U.S. industry. And we're going to speed up the development and the purchase of new weapons, and we're going to ensure the country can produce them at a scale and pace required during wartime. When the best defense experts, writing in the Washington Post, New York Times, and other sources said, you'll be lucky if you see something in 3 to 4 years because of what's involved with manufacturing these things. Now, what I think Secretary of Defense Hegseth doesn't realize, and I know it's rather presumptuous for me to say something like that, is that the entire Defense Department is headed towards a reality crash down because of the decades of deindustrialization that we've been doing since Greenspan, along with a decrease in skilled labor in manufacturing, have led us to a point that we are no longer in a position to rapidly increase productive capabilities as we were able to do during World War II. And so you just keep hearing a lot of talk I don't know if it's for distraction or if it's because they're sending out messages or whatever. I don't know. Something else I wanted to bring to your attention this Monday morning is that even though Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu made this special point last week of publicly stating that he would not cooperate with President Trump's plan to disarm Hamas, yesterday he opened up his weekly cabinet meeting as if Trump hadn't heard a word he said. And according to the Times of Israel, Netanyahu said this: I want to clarify here, Israel rejects the 15-point document. And he added that part of Trump's plan, he said, are unacceptable to us, and we know how to stand up to these things. We have proven this in the past, and we're proving it today as well. Then Netanyahu explained that some thought that he had not rejected Trump's arrangement. He said this: I heard people say, you didn't say so, so I'm here saying it again. Israel rejects the 15-point document. And on the day of the signed agreement between Trump's Board of Peace and Hamas, it was Netanyahu's office that stated the objection. And then a few days later, Netanyahu, in his own name, took to the airwaves in Israel to undermine and to the agreement, but to underline that the deal was dead on arrival. We're having nothing to do with it. And so since then, there's been this back and forth issue with Washington, as you have seen Netanyahu making several trips to Washington over the last few weeks. And so yesterday he doubled down, and his position, which he reiterated at that cabinet meeting, is that Israel's military, quote, Israel's military will not move an inch backwards until we have decided that every Hamas weapon, pistol, gun, knife, or whatever can be used as an excuse for a weapon is gone. So aside from this being somewhat of an overt, gross violation of the agreement he signed last year, the likelihood of him ever finding a way out of this, to agree with this 15-point plan, I mean, it's very remote. He went on to communicate his threat to any deal Trump might make with Iran. It wasn't enough that he rejected this 15-point plan. He said, I'm not going to accept any deal that Trump makes with Iran. And then here's this little country that has control of this big country that we live in, telling us what we are and we are not going to do relative to Iran. And this little country over there, who has no political significance for us whatsoever, except in the sense except in the sense of the great misnomer of the great democracy, this democratic state, about the only democratic state. Israel is not a democracy. Get that out of your head right now. Half of its population isn't even allowed to vote. Anyway, after Netanyahu was praising Trump in the United States because of the United States' attempt to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, he said this: "With an agreement or without an agreement, as long as I'm prime minister, Iran will not possess nuclear weapons. Unlike all those who preach to us, we are doing what needs to be done for Israel's security. And we can and know how to stand our ground even against our very best friends when necessary." In other words, Trump can go ahead and make his deal with Iran, but we're going to blow it up. So, two of the other incarnations of evil on this planet, his finance minister Smotrich and his security minister Ben-Gvir, two of the most egregious blood and soil racists in Netanyahu's cabinet, of course praised what Netanyahu had to say about Trump in the United States. And they issued a statement that made clear what Netanyahu did not say explicitly, that not only Hamas, but Gaza itself is going to be completely dismantled. So Smotrich said this, the finance minister in Israel, one of the strongest members of the Likud. After Netanyahu said what he said, Smotrich said, "We went to war with a central goal, the destruction of Hamas. The military cannot withdraw even a millimeter from the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip cannot begin any process of reconstruction before the complete dismantling and demobilization of Hamas and the Gaza Strip." And otherwise, the top Israeli officials had the, what's the word? Chutzpah, I think, to complain that Hamas is exploiting the disarmament process in order to prevent renewed Israeli military action. Times of Israel said they have reportedly called Hamas's agreement to disarm a strategic ambush of Israel. How can an outfit like Hamas, that is holding up further invasion into Gaza by the IDF, be in such a position that the IDF can completely dismantle them, when they are in fact the one force that keeps the IDF out of Gaza? I always wondered about that. All right, now, I was going to say something more about Colby and what he was trying to scare the crowds with a possible nuclear attack on the United States. And one of the reasons why we need to greatly increase our tactical nukes. But I think I've said enough. Just two positions away from the president. But he says what he fears more than anything is a mass attack against the United States of a nuclear nature. How long have you been hearing that? I mean, you've been hearing that ever since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But when you combine AIPAC's control of Congress, and I can't believe I just said that, but that's the case. AIPAC controls Congress. Even though there are more and more Democratic members of both houses standing up against AIPAC. And in some cases it's working because they are winning primaries in this country, but in other cases they're losing primaries. Hopefully we'll have time before the program's over to get into that more specifically. But there's talk in Germany about worrying about how Russia will change their target from the Ukraine to Germany. Now, one of their defense people, Brigadier General Eric Vaude, V-A-D, former secretary advisor, security advisor to Angela Merkel, another incarnation of evil, has given several interviews lately to mainstream media about Germany's position in all of this. And he said that we're approaching the day when Russia could lose its patience and retaliate against Germany, which has no defense. And so while he was describing the situation for Ukraine as being hopeless and laughing at the so-called war experts who say the opposite, his assessment is similar to many non-mainstream observers, with the important difference that there's hardly a more qualified expert than the general to talk about such matters. And he said this: the war is now entering its 5th year, and the military situation, I mean in the Donbass, is exceptionally bad for the Ukraine. He said completely different from how it's being portrayed in the media. He said they have major problems with manpower, that is, recruiting personnel to fight. He said this: hundreds of thousands of young Ukrainians have fled abroad, 300,000 to Germany alone. And that's a massive problem, he said. The Russians are also advancing, albeit slowly, simply because of this drone warfare and the transparent battlefield which is associated with it. So classic warfare of maneuvering isn't even possible there anymore. Nevertheless, they're advancing, albeit slowly. Now, you've heard that from many sources, that they aren't fighting this war like the Russians coming into Germany from the east and the Americans coming into Germany from the west in 1945. Battleground after battleground after battleground. Not when you have drones. And so you still have a front line. You still have a defensive line. But because of the massive amount of drones that the Ukrainians have against the Russians, and the massive amount of drones the Russians are getting from Iran to be used against the Ukrainians, it's kind of a standoff type of thing. Excuse me, where you send in one wave of drones after another. Some of these drones are big enough that they go after armament, but a lot of them are small enough where they go after the individual soldier. You know, I've talked about this before. Just imagine yourself on this front line, and you're waiting to hear some little buzz up in the air. And so in your platoon of, say, a dozen soldiers under the control of a sergeant, and you're trying to maintain some defensive position, and then among the platoon, you've got a couple of the soldiers who have those guns that are supposed to shoot down these drones. But a lot of these drones, once you hear them, you only got a few seconds before they hit you. And they hit you with an explosive charge big enough to tear you in half. You don't walk away from a drone attack. You hopefully have your papers in order. Your affairs have been put in order. And so this, not only is this spectacular drone war between Russia and Ukraine distracting right now of what's going on in the Donbass, but the Russians probably will have conquered the entire Donbass by the end of the year. And then they also have, which is hardly covered in the media, essentially taken out the port facilities around Odessa. The more I try to find information about that, the less there is, because they're not reporting it. Which means foreign trade with Ukraine is no longer possible. And Odessa is critically important as a port facility and for foreign trade relations for the Ukraine. which means they basically have a very difficult situation now for the Ukrainians, who are further removed from what is being claimed in the media and by the experts that Russian victory is imminent. And at the same time, there's this supposedly deep war strategy, these strikes on the Russian side, of course, into the Ukraine and into Ukraine's hinterland, and then what the Ukrainians are doing deep into the Russian hinterland. And it's very intense, and Moscow's been hit, as has this Russian online retailer, Wildberries, I think it is. And so that has, of course, entailed significant disadvantages for the Russians, which is very clear from a Russian perspective as well, but it won't decide the war. So the impressions being conveyed that victory is possible through these deep strike operations is simply, that's what people say who absolutely have no clue about war, warfare, or the military. And that's the situation, because when you cut off a major supply line like Odessa, what have you got left? So the big question is, what are the Russians going to do now? And that's exactly what poses this massive risk of escalation. And despite Ukraine's bravery up to this point, and despite the good equipment it has received from the West, the Russians still hold the upper hand in terms of escalation in all areas, right up to the nuclear realm. And the major danger is simply that at some point, they'll no longer just target Ukraine itself from a strategic perspective, but the deeper parts of the western areas of the Ukraine. And there have already been indications that Western Europe is being included in their targeting plans. Now, this isn't scaremongering, but it's very serious, and a likely possible reaction by the Russians over the long term to deal with this, because they just can't go on having these missiles and drones being fired into the Russian hinterland. And by hinterland, I mean more than 500 miles from the border with Ukraine. Now, in case you missed it, the U.S. Senate voted last Wednesday, I think it was, to approve the anti-Russia sanctions bill with an anti-Iranian provision included that was crafted by the late warmongering Senator Lindsey Graham. The bill would penalize countries that continue to buy Russian oil and gas and other exports on the spurious notion that it is the revenues from those exports that are fueling the war in the Ukraine, and not the U.S., NATO, European Union objective of using the Kyiv regime to inflict strategic defeat on Russia. And so this comes after the Ukrainian acting president Zelensky, visited the Capitol building last week that followed Graham's funeral. And Zelensky met with senators from both parties and watched from the gallery as the Senate took the first procedural vote preliminary to the full chamber vote, as is reported by Associated Press. All right, I think I said all I want to say about what happened with Nagasaki. So, my other notes here. On August 4th, so the beginning of last week, Ukraine's security service announced the conclusion of this much vaunted 40-day influence campaign that was declared by Ukraine's acting president in late June. The announced purpose of influencing Russia to just end the war, to give up and go home. And of course, the campaign was clearly designed to convince the West that the tide of war had turned in Ukraine's favor. I can't remember, I can't count the number of news reports saying that the tide of battle was turning. But highlights of that 40-day period included attempts to cut off all fuel and other supplies to the Crimea, trying to destroy Russian shipping through the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea, continuing to disrupt Russia's domestic fuel supplies by drone attacks on refineries, and most recently destroy the warehouses of Wildberries, which, as you know, is Russia's version of Amazon. And so there is mounting evidence that a failed August 1st assassination attempt in Moscow on Russia's Aerospace Forces commander, Alexander Chayko, was part of the package. It's now been confirmed that his son-in-law was one of 5 people killed in that restaurant bombing. While this week there have been 2 funerals of senior military officers close to Chayko. So on July 13th, during an exhibition of the Russian drone technologies, President Putin said that Russia's response to Ukrainian attacks would be mirror-like. Several times more powerful, he said. And that promise has been borne out in the demolition of Ukraine's logistics, as Russia during that 40-day period crippled Ukraine's key ports in the Odessa region that I've talked about, destroying hundreds of gas stations in eastern Ukraine, damaging or destroying 100 to 200 railroad locomotives, and in addition to military warehouses. So they claim they've hit more than 100 strategic objects behind enemy lines, including military airfields, over that same 40 days. And Ukraine has exhausted its ability to defend against Russian missiles because every Russian missile is now getting through to its target. So what's going on here? You know, within hours of that report, Russia hit Kyiv with 24 ballistic and 4 hypersonic missiles, launched at industrial sites and warehouses in Kyiv. On the night of August 4th, 5th, the Ukrainian Air Force confirmed that they were unable to bring down any of the 28 missiles. A new record. It's interesting that Ukraine came out and admitted that. We couldn't shoot down one of them. Where does that leave you? The Ukrainian Air Force, among other things, reported the massive fiery destruction of Kyiv's warehouse district on the western side of the Dnieper River, in addition to the Black Sea ports in and around Odessa, along with 3 ships in the western Black Sea hit again, as part of Russia's denial of access to the Ukraine by Black Sea shipping. So, how much longer? How much longer can this possibly last? Now, the Washington Post published this story last week claiming that a very, very frustrated President Trump, accusing the self-styled Secretary of War of not being truthful about the status of munitions stockpiles during a cabinet meeting at the end of July at Camp David. Remember that? Now, when someone who has the last word about something, like the commander-in-chief, suddenly gets all upset about something that all the news agencies know about, podcasters know about, defense strategists in foreign countries know about, and suddenly the president finds out about it and starts blaming it on Hegseth. What was the first thing Hegseth did when the president blamed him for not keeping the president up to date on our shortfall of weapons? He turned around and blamed Stephen Feinberg, his deputy, for not fixing the problem and not keeping Trump apprised of the situation. Now just picture that. You're sitting there in this meeting at Camp David with the president, and a lot of the cabinet's there, and a lot of military people are there. And then you're watching from across the room President Trump exploding in anger at Hegseth. And what's Hegseth do? Don't look at me, look at Feinberg. I'm sorry, but according to the Post, Washington Post that was there, quote, the exchange underscored Trump's increasing frustration with his defense secretary, who was one of the biggest early advocates for taking military action against Iran, convincing Trump it would be quick and relatively easy win, according to multiple officials. So both the White House and the Pentagon responded to the Post's story, saying it was fiction and it was fake news. Meanwhile, what I was saying earlier, the stories about munition shortages continues to proliferate. CNN said this last Wednesday, quote, multiple sources familiar with the matter, that the U.S. military has exhausted nearly 80% of its interceptors for a key missile defense system, as U.S. military commanders are warning that the Pentagon's munitions stockpile is dangerously low. Excuse me. So you have U.S. military commanders, unnamed, because they're not going to come out because they know if they say anything, they'll be fired. And they're trying to climb up one more grade, go from a 2-star to a 3-star, or they're not going to go to a 4-star, but a 2-star to a 3-star for their retirement. And so they allow this atrocity to continue. But if there are defense senior military commanders saying we've lost 80% of our defense capability, and the president's acting like he doesn't know this till the Camp David meeting, the inventory of THAAD missiles has reportedly been reduced to 4/5, while the stockpile of Patriot missiles is down by a half. And of course, the replenishment rates, as I talked about at the beginning of the show, are, well, the Pentagon is, let me put it this way with some numbers. The Pentagon is receiving roughly 15 new Tomahawks and 20 new Patriots a month. Think about that. How many Tomahawks have been fired? How many Patriots have to be fired for one incoming missile, whether it's coming from Yemen or from Iran? And all they're getting a month is 15 Tomahawks and 20 new Patriots. And the Center for Strategic and International Studies said it would take 3 or more years to rebuild THAAD inventories to pre-Iran war levels. 3 years. And then about the same time that CNN story came out, Reuters posted an article claiming that the U.S. Army had exhausted nearly its entire inventory of ground-launched missiles. And the Army had been firing not only ATACMS, but also its replacement, the Precision Strike Missile, the PrSM, from HIMARS launchers from Iraq and into Iraq from Kuwait. And the IRGC issued several statements during July saying that they had been targeting those HIMARS launchers, but any losses they might have inflicted are not accounted for in the Reuters report. And then Reuters sources declined to say how many of each type of missile the Army had left. But what's important is that they're running out. So, Putin, how much time we got left? Just a couple minutes. I think that might be, I wanted to get more into Israel's trying to take over the West Bank. I think I might save that. I might save that for tomorrow. But I did want to mention this one thing quickly, and that is ICE, Immigration's Custom Enforcement, has weaponized social media now to compile a watch list of U.S. citizens. Now, if you have felt that you've been left out by not being on lists somewhere, the social media posts are being weaponized against U.S. citizens by ICE as it claims to search for potential threats of violence against federal agents or plans to disrupt enforcement efforts, according to an article in the Wall Street Journal. And I just briefly wanted to mention that because the critics have long warned that immigration enforcement is nothing but a smokescreen. Now, just wait a second and listen to this. ICE isn't just looking for immigration violators or customs violators. ICE, according to some personal security in the sense of constitutional security, Constitutional Bill of Rights security experts, are claiming that it's just a smokescreen for much wider domestic surveillance and militarized social control, and that the surveillance of private social media posts is nothing but a pretext for looking for political opponents. So on the surface, you've got these images, these video images of ICE finding the bad guys and getting them out of the country, of which some of the numbers I've seen are up around 3 million so far. What might be going on is something insidious. In this sense, you know, I kind of laughed at one time when I would see posts with purposefully misspelled words, thinking, you know, come on. Back in the COVID days, when people would have posts about vaccine damage and they would use the $sign for VACC, it would be VA $INE for vaccine. Hopefully that their podcast would not be picked up by internal surveillance. Well, the Wall Street Journal says it's going on, it's happening. Nearly 20 social media sites are monitored according to the Wall Street Journal, are monitored 24/7, including Reddit, Discord, Snapchat, and LinkedIn, for the wrong words. All right. We've only got about a minute left here. I'm going to end the recording. I just want to tell you that I have a couple of openings this week. They will go fast for me to be able to take care of people. If you've got long-standing headaches, migraines, back pain, sciatica, difficulty getting out of bed in the morning, and this has been going on for a long time and nothing has helped, you might want to sit down and just have a free talk with me. It has to be scheduled, 801-523-1890. We'll sit down and talk about it and see if there's something that I can do for you. It probably is. We've had a lot of success lately. We're very successful in a very short period of time of helping people overcome this pain. You have to call the office, 801-523-1890, if you or someone you know or some loved one is still suffering. You want to fix it now, not when the proverbial stuff hits the fan, as a lot of experts tell us is coming. All right, I think I'm going to thank you for those of you who've been listening. I didn't get around to Trump declaring victory. We'll have to do that tomorrow. But for those of you listening on the stream, if you can like and subscribe, I really would appreciate it. Help